Now we want to turn things over to our Josh Taylor, who has more on the passing of Franco Harris. And Josh, what do you remember most about him?
I have gotten the opportunity professionally to meet Franco Harris, whether as a reporter or as an anchor, and there were always a couple of different things that if you ran into Franco, you knew you'd hear them and you knew you'd hear them with a smile on his face. One, he loved talking about playing at Penn State. He's proud to be a Penn State alumnus. But number two, he loved to tell you anything involving, just merely involving being a Pittsburgh Steeler and being in Pittsburgh. That was the thing he loved discussing the most. It could be any topic. It could be any story. But if you asked him about the Immaculate Reception, his eyes would just completely light up. But it was one of those things where when you grew up in the generation I grew up in, I'm in my early 40s. So you were alive for the latter part of Franco Harris's career, but you weren't alive for the Immaculate Reception. You weren't alive for the lion's share of his career. But you were told by older siblings, you were told by your parents, you were told by your grandparents. Those stories were always passed down, and you'd always see the footage, and it's so iconic to this day. But Franco Harris was one of the people that actually identified you with the Pittsburgh Steelers growing up in that generation. I can remember just even moving away from Pittsburgh for a couple of years. If you were a Pittsburgh expatriate and you even came back to visit, once you got to Pittsburgh International Airport and you were coming down that escalator, one of the first things you saw that reminded you were home was that Franco Harris statue. That was like your confirmation that you were on black and gold soil. And I think that's something that a lot of people identify with, and I saw one of the outlets here had a story about that, just that statue and what it meant to so many different people. But you always do when somebody out of town was in town or somebody who lived in town came back, because they would always post a picture of the Franco statue. It was almost like the rite of passage. Hey, you're back in Pittsburgh, got to show the picture of Franco and the statue at the airport. But that was one of those things, one of those parts of the fabric that was woven into this city that Franco Harris was. And I think that's one of those things that, you know, growing up you always remember. And I think it makes it even harder to digest all this with just the timing of it all, knowing that we're going into the 50th anniversary of the Immaculate Reception. That celebration is coming up this weekend. They were going to honor him at Heinz Field. They're scheduled to retire his number 32, which is a high enough honor in and of itself, because I don't think people realize the Steelers don't retire a lot of jersey numbers. They're very selective in which numbers they retire. So the fact that number 32 is being retired by this organization is just a huge honor in and of itself. But to hear this happen just days before that's supposed to take place is just absolutely heartbreaking. There's no better way to put it. And especially with this organization having so much history tied to that one event, because if people don't really remember, this was the Steelers' first ever playoff victory in their franchise's history, was the Immaculate Reception. So not only did it, kind of open the door for a lot of championship success, it opened the door for just playoff success in general, because they had never gotten that far in the playoff actual picture until that victory in 1972. Then a couple years later, the Super Bowl victory happened, and then three more happened after that. And by then, the legacy of Franco Harris was stamped. But there is so much that is tied just to the history of this franchise and also the history of this city that Franco Harris is just completely intertwined with.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things that Pittsburgh natives and Pittsburgh residents and Pittsburgh expats will always remember, and they'll always hold that as part of their own personal history.
And that's the one thing, Josh, we really want to emphasize, is just more of the impact that he had here locally, not just as an amazing athlete, but the fact that he was so involved in the community. Josh, thank you so much. We'll get back to you, I imagine, more on Franco's history and what the impact he has made here in Pittsburgh and beyond.